Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, we're starting our complete look at every single armor item in Baldur's Gate 3. Their strengths and weaknesses, what characters they're good for, and whether they're worth keeping at all, or whether they're just Gale food. We're starting off today with robes and clothing. So these are armor items that require no proficiencies at all, meaning they're usable by wizards, sorcerers, and monks, as well as every other character class. That means that they will often be used by spellcasters and high damage characters, and as such are some of the most important items in the game. These robes will determine how well defended your characters are, and that's very good for characters that are often quite squishy, like wizards and sorcerers, and also have some of the more powerful enchantments in the game available on them, so knowing which ones to bring can really help power up your party. Since these are the most widely available armors, they're also the ones that are most hotly contested by your party members, because any party member can use them, which means there's always 4 characters who have the potential to wear any of these armors. I've divided these armors by act. So the first 8 armors that we're going to be looking at, up to the Robe of Summer here, are available in Act 1. The next 7, up to the Robe of Exquisite Focus, are available in Act 2, and all the others are first available in Act 3. So we're going to be rating them based on their strength when you acquire them. So, as we go through the list, the armors to the right will be stronger in terms of sort of average absolute power, because the items that you get later on in the game will be, on average, more powerful than the items you get early in the game. But this is most useful because it tells you whether it's actually worth wearing and equipping this item when you first find it. It's also worth noting that unlike a lot of my other tier lists, armors are exclusive, right? You can only wear one at a time, and there's only 4 characters in the game, so only 4 of these maximum can be in use at any given time. That means that most playthroughs are only ever going to interact with the very best armors. So there's going to be a pretty severe drop-off from S and A tier armors to B, C, and D tier armors in terms of how often they're used. With that in mind, I've chosen to divide them into 5 tiers, based on S tier, with S tier, meaning armors that are going to be best in slot when you find them, either for a very common build or for a particularly powerful build, and armors that are relevant throughout the entire game. A tier armors are either best in slot for very specific builds or just interesting alternatives to the S tier armors. B tier might have some usage in some situations or particularly unusual party comps. C tier has maybe something interesting going for it, and if you want to build around it, then you can. It will provide you with a not totally embarrassing bonus, but it's definitely outweighed by items at the higher tiers. And then D tier, there are very rarely circumstances where you would want to equip it. I have chosen not to include an F tier because there are no armors that make your character actively worse, so whatever you choose to wear won't actively hurt you. But the D tier armors are mostly going to be used to turn into gold or feed to Gale rather than actually wear them. Finally, before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Kyle Head for the $25 donation, Megatron for the $10, Teo Rini for the €18, and Alex Barbeau and Tyler Ohala for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really do appreciate the support, and it really does mean a lot. Alright, let's get rating robes. First up, the Armour of Uninhibited, Kushigo. So despite the name, this is a robe, or rather a clothing set, not an armor. You don't count as armored when wearing it, and you get to keep your monk class abilities, which is important, because this robe only works for monks. It gives you the Kushigo counter ability, which allows you to, while you have patient defense active, make an unarmed strike against any attacker who misses you with an attack. Patient Defense is a monk ability, you get it at level 2, and costs your bonus action and a key point to activate, makes attacks against you have disadvantage for the turn. Now, monks have typically relatively low armor class, and the Armor of Uninhibited Kushigo doesn't help with that. It's not going to increase your armor class, so enemies are not that likely to miss their attacks against you if you're playing a monk, and also enemies just aren't that likely to attack a monk because you want to be out of melee using your movement speed or having stunned or just killed enemies before they get to go. Patient Defense is by far the least useful of your key point bonus actions, that it costs you a Flurry of Blows or a Step of the Wind, so you're very unlikely to use it unless you get yourself in a bad position and are totally surrounded by enemies, in which case making a single unarmed strike is not going to make the difference between winning or losing that fight. What will make the difference is either not having that happen in the first place or having gotten out of there. I can see maybe some kind of retaliation build where you use this armor alongside Patient Defense and very high AC with a cool multi-class to do something, but even as like a specialist monk item, it doesn't succeed because it doesn't really help with Monk's plan at all, and obviously it's useless for every other class, so I'm going to say that this is a C tier item at best. There is potential to build around this item as something that you might want to do with Patient Defense, very high armor class, and try to just generate a lot of off-turn attacks. You could maybe make some sort of build work with that. I don't think it would be very strong, but the potential is maybe there. And as just a straight-up armor set for any character, it's basically useless. So C tier, not recommended. The Bloodguzzler Garb. So this clothing gives you no armor class, but gives you the ability to gain 2 stacks of Wrath whenever an enemy does damage to you. The in-game tooltip is wrong. It says 1 stack of Wrath, but it actually gives 2, and Wrath is an effect that increases your melee damage by 1 per turn remaining, up to a maximum of 7. So Wrath stacking can be pretty powerful, especially if you're making a lot of melee attacks per turn. Plus 7 damage to all of your attacks is a pretty powerful strategy. The tricky part is that you have to get hit, which means that you, 1, have to let your enemies take a turn, and 2, they have to attack specifically this character. So it's best used against enemies who do AoE damage or provide ways that you can trigger this on purpose, like if they set up a damaging surface on the ground that you can then walk into to trigger the Bloodguzzler Garb and stack Wrath, then you can benefit from it. And it's best for characters who are doing lots of attacks in a turn, so dual wielders and characters like that, or like a Swords Bard or something, could benefit the most from the Bloodguzzler Garb, but those characters often have better armor sets anyways. Ironically, the character that could probably use this the best would be a monk, except it doesn't work on unarmed strikes, because monks just attack so often, but Wrath doesn't work for unarmed attacks, so monks can't really benefit from it as well as other characters. So the Bloodguzzler Garb is a pretty powerful effect, but one that's relatively hard to use, and there's just better sources of Wrath that we'll talk about a little bit later on in this tier list even, available in your chest slot. For the characters that might want to use this. That being said, Wrath stacking is still very powerful, so, and this will be a totally reasonable choice for an unarmored barbarian in the early game, so I'm going to place it in B tier, but not one that I would suggest going out of your way to use, since it's such a build-around item. You have to really dedicate your character to using it, and the fight has to go perfectly for it to have an effect. The Graceful Cloth. The Graceful Cloth gives you Cat's Grace, which it works the same as the Enhance Ability spell, so gives you advantage on dexterity checks, that's saving throws, not checks, and halves damage that you take from falling damage. Basically giving you advantage on sleight of hand checks, so very useful for a character that's doing that. It also gives you the Nimble as a Cat ability, which gives you a +1 to your dex saves, and increases your jump distance by 5 feet. Increases to jump distance are great, especially for dex-based characters who might otherwise not be able to jump far enough, if they don't have the strength to support it. But the real prize here is it increases your dexterity by 2. I don't have to tell you that dexterity is amazing. It's the best attribute in the game. It increases your initiative, which is critically important. It increases your armor class. So this is as good at boosting your armor class as any other armor available in Act 1 by giving you any other cloth armor available in Act 1 by giving you +1 armor. And it also, for dexterity characters, increases their attack and damage. Dexterity is so good And the ability to increase your dexterity by 2 from an item means that you will hit 20 much earlier than you would otherwise, or characters that aren't going to boost their dexterity can boost it with the Graceful Cloth. It won't let you go over 20, and it won't stack with the Gloves of Dexterity, so those are the only two things holding this item back, but plus 2 dexterity is just such an insane ability that the Graceful Cloth is incredibly powerful. It also is, sadly, in my opinion, maybe the single ugliest armor in Baldur's Gate 3, which is really too bad, because almost every party is going to have someone wearing it. It's just that good. I think that the Graceful Cloth is the strongest item on this entire list, including all of the Act 3 items. It is just that powerful and will remain best in slot for your some members of your party basically throughout the entire game. Baldur's Gate 3 is a game of going first. Initiative is just that powerful, and the Graceful Cloth lets you do that. It lets you get an additional feat on a character who would normally have to take an ability score improvement to hit 20 dexterity. It gives you just an absurd amount of options, and also just gives you a bunch of other stats that you want. Advantage on sleight of hand checks is great. Jump distance is super helpful because mobility is very, very important. The Graceful Cloth is an easy and obvious S tier item. The Infernal Robe. So this requires a specific and somewhat unusual story choice, so many playthroughs won't see this item at all. But it's a pretty powerful robe that gives you +1 to your armor class, so other than the Graceful Cloth, it's the only one we've seen here that actually makes you harder to hit, as well as resistance to fire damage, which is the most common damage type in the game, so a very relevant resistance, and the ability to cast Fire Shield, the level 4 spell Fire Shield, as a bonus action once per long rest. Only for the warm version, but that's the version you would probably use anyways, in most encounters. The warm version of Fire Shield also gives you cold resistance, so this item effectively gives you resistance to both fire and cold damage, two very relevant resistances, which is pretty nice. The Fire Shield cast itself gives you access to a 4th level spell much sooner than you probably were going to get it, since 4th level spells are not necessarily available easily in Act 1. But it's a 4th level spell that requires you to get hit, which is something that you don't want to do if you're wearing a robe like this. Especially for most wizards, sorcerers, warlocks, etc. The +1 armor class is the important part of this ability, and also the fire resistance is relevant, so you don't just get torched by a fireball, but the Fire Shield itself is not going to be very useful. That said, it's one of the earliest robes that actually increases your armor class. It provides 2 pretty relevant defensive abilities, so while it doesn't increase your offense, which is mostly what you're looking for from robes, it's still a pretty good armor item. I'm going to put it in A tier, because often these characters will just have better options, or are looking for offensive abilities rather than defensive abilities from a robe or clothing set, but it is definitely a wearable item in Act 1 when you get it. The power level is there, it's just not necessarily in things that you particularly want. Special shout out for this item also for barbarians, for unarmored barbarians who can use the Fire Shield since it's not concentration, while raging, and they will get hit, so that's a much more relevant usage of Fire Shield, but they also, again, just have items that they are more likely to want to wear at this point in the game. The Poisoner's Robe. Poisoner's Robe gives you, whenever you cast a spell that deals poison damage, it deals an extra 1d4 poison damage. There aren't that many spells in the game that deal poison damage, and this ability could be pretty good if it boosted like fire damage or something that had multi-hit spells. But poison damage, the direct damage spell is Ray of Sickness, which, unlike Scorching Ray, there's only ever one Ray of Sickness. You only ever get 1d4 of extra poison damage. So the most times you're going to be able to activate this is with Cloud Kill, the level 5 spell, where the extra 2d4 damage that you get once when you cast it and once at the start of the enemy's turn is not totally irrelevant, so you could maybe use this if you're doing some kind of cloud kill combo. But again, if you're doing something like that, you would much rather have an item that increases your save DC, or to just improve your average damage from cloud kill better than the Poisoner's Robe does, or just an item that allows you to go first more often. Poisoner's Robe is a D tier item. I just don't think there's any circumstance where this is going to be better than an alternative. The Protecty Sparkswall. I just realized I had the Potent Robe in the wrong spot. It's not available till Act 2, so you may notice a glitch in the space-time continuum where that's jumped over. The Protecty Sparkswall is an item that provides +1 to your spell save DC, and also gives you the Sparkswall Armour ability. You have +1 to your armor class and saving throws as long as you have lightning charges. Lightning charges you can generate through a lot of different items. The easiest way is probably to have the water sparkers that give you them for standing in water alongside the sparks wall itself that makes you immune to the electrocution effect of that water to just constantly generate lightning charges, and have the +1 armor class and saving throws from the Protecty Sparkswall. The Protecty Sparkswall should probably be called the Attacky Sparkswall though, because it's much more of an offensive item than a defensive item. The lightning charge ability is very rarely useful and not one that I would really worry about building around. Obviously, +1 to AC and saves is a good ability, so if you are already doing a lightning charge thing, then, it's fine. But the real prize of this is just that it gives you +1 to your spell save DC, and it's the earliest chest slot item that can give you +1 to your save DC on a robe or cloth. That's very, very important to spellcasters. Save DC is probably the #1 ability that spellcasters want. You get this in Act 1, it's going to stay very relevant throughout almost the entire game, just making your spells harder to resist. It doesn't increase your spell attack rolls, but it does increase your ability to land your spells with saving throws, which is more important for most spellcasters. So the Protecty Sparkswall is just going to be best in slot for, every spellcaster that wants to wear a robe throughout Act 1 and 2, so it's an S-tier item. This is a bit of an unassuming item. It doesn't look like it's going to be an S-tier item, but save DC is that powerful, and you get this very, very early, or you can get this very, very early, and it's one of the only sources of increased save DC available early like this, so S-tier. And for the final item available in Act 1, the Robe of Summer. The Robe of Summer just gives you resistance to cold damage, straight up. In order for this to be good, you would have to be going into a fight which is primarily cold damage. Most of the cold damage in the game is from spellcasters who have lots of other options. Need another elixir equipped, so you couldn't use an elixir of cold resistance and have no other source of cold resistance, like protection from elements or whatever. And need that more than you needed other abilities. The Robe of Summer is just so incredibly narrow in usage that it will just never come up. Cold Resistance is a moderately powerful ability, but there's way better sources that don't cost you an entire gear slot, and you would have to swap this in. I will say for the Robe of Summer that it looks sick, so you can wear it for drip purposes, but that's the only reason you would ever wear it. Next up, the first of the Act 2 items, the Bided Time. The Bided Time gives you Arcane Charge whenever you're struck by a melee attack. Arcane Charge increases the damage of your spells by +2 for as long as you have it. And so this is a fairly powerful effect, because with multi-hit spells, you can deal +2 damage on every hit. So with Magic Missile or Scorching Ray, you can deal a lot of damage. This item was actually changed, the Bided Time. It used to be triggerable through any melee attack, so you could have your mage hand there punching you to trigger the effect and deal the additional damage, but now is only triggerable through an enemy attack. The +2 damage from Arcane Charge only applies to threatened enemies, and the tooltip on this item is wrong. It says while you are threatened, you do +2 damage with your spells, but it's actually only enemies who themselves are threatened, so in base contact with a melee ally of yours, will receive the +2 damage. This is most useful for an Abjuration Wizard who wants to be hit by enemy melee attacks anyways, but for basically any other character, it's just too unreliable to trigger this effect because enemies won't attack you. And for an Abjuration Wizard, enemies will very rarely the enemy AI will rarely actually target you. The easiest way to trigger this effect is to deliberately trigger attacks of opportunity by moving next to enemies and then moving away. Then you get hit by the attack and then you gain +2 damage. Is that worth spending your chest slot on and taking multiple hits? For an Abjuration Wizard, I would say it is, but for other characters, not so much. But this is a good way to boost magic missile damage for a magic missile build or something like that, if you can afford to take the hits. For that reason, I'm going to put it in B tier, because you have to do a lot of work to make it work. So it's similar to the Bloodguzzler Robe, where you have to just build your entire strategy around making it work, but the payoff is actually real, so B tier item. The Enraging Heart Garb. The Enraging Heart Garb gives you +2 to your Constitution, which is a pretty powerful ability by itself. That's +1 hit point per level, so at max level, +12 hit points, and +1 to your con saves. Even though this is sort of targeted at barbarians, +2 Constitution is much more useful for spellcasters, where that's a bigger proportion of your hit points that you're gaining from it, and also because spellcasters need concentration saves, need their con saves to be high to maintain concentration on spells. So +2 Constitution is pretty good for those characters. The Enraging Heart Garb also has a totally bugged ability, Ruin Tamer Heart, which is supposed to give you Wrath, just like the Bloodguzzler Garb, when you enter Rage. It's supposed to give you 2 turns of Wrath when you enter a Rage. It doesn't do anything at all, so that ability is just completely bugged. If it worked, it would be pretty powerful, because Wrath is just a very good effect, and that would be a very easy way to trigger it, but unfortunately, it's bugged out. That being said, +2 Constitution is just a very good effect to have passively on an item, especially for a spellcaster item, so this is still an A tier item. It is very likely that you will not hit the 20 Constitution cap, because most characters want to improve their spellcasting stat or their combat stat rather than their Constitution. So getting to go from the fairly standard 16 to 18 Constitution makes you much more survivable, much better at maintaining concentration on your spells. So this is definitely a good option if you're worried about getting hit. The Enraging Heart Garb is just a solid item. +2 Constitution is a good effect. It's not going to be as good as the more offensive effects, but as a defensive effect, totally reasonable. The Icebite Robe. The Icebite Robe gives you resistance to cold damage, so very similar to the Robe of Summer, and also lets you cast Armour of Agathis at 3rd level once per long rest. So that's +15 hit points and 15 cold retaliation damage every time you get hit. The key here is that you can cast it and then just take the item off, and you get to keep the Armour of Agathis for your long rest. It's an Abjuration spell, so you can use it to build Abjuration charges for your Abjuration Wizard, or just have 15 temporary hit points and a little bit of retaliation damage on any character who doesn't naturally get temporary hit points. So basically, if this is a slightly click-intensive way of just getting a scroll of getting a scroll of Armour of Agathis once per long rest at 3rd level, and that's a very reasonable thing for an item to be. If you're building a sort of maximally optimized party, this will feature somewhere in your party. You're probably going to be casting it once per day. Personally, I don't think it's worth the clicks, but there's definitely builds that can benefit from it. And of course, for Abjuration Wizards in particular, who just want to cast any Abjuration spells in order to restack their Arcane Ward while they're outside of combat, this gives them more adventuring longevity. So just a very solid item. I'm going to put it in A tier because it's not one you actually wear. You just use it for the spell effect, but that spell effect is very good, so A tier. Next up, the Mighty Cloth. So the Mighty Cloth is the equivalent of the Graceful Cloth, but for strength instead of for dexterity. It gives you +2 to your strength and the Bull's strength effect from the Enhance Ability spell, so advantage on strength checks and double your carry capacity. Advantage on strength checks is overall less useful than advantage on dexterity checks. It also makes you immune to being moved by enemy effects, gives you advantage on saving throws against being restrained, and gives you the Bull Rush ability. Now, the Bull Rush ability has a completely incorrect tooltip. The tooltip is just wrong. They copy-pasted it from Primal Stampede, the Elkhart Barbarian's ability, but that's not what it does at all. It doesn't do damage, can be used while not raging, etc. Instead, what it does is you charge up to 30 feet and knock back enemies up to 10 feet along your direction of charge. So it's a push. It has nothing to do with Primal Stampede. They just copied the wrong tooltip when they were putting together this item. The main feature here, of course, is the +2 strength, and it's +2 strength up to a maximum of 20, which is very good for characters that care about increasing their strength, but a lot of those characters are going to have access to heavier armor if they are a strength-based character. And in Baldur's Gate 3, if you want to increase your strength, the elixirs exist. So for a Tavern Brawler monk or something like that, they will almost certainly just be using elixirs rather than messing around with small strength increases. Just set your strength to maximum value using elixirs. So the Mighty Cloth is mostly going to be useful for a Tavern Brawler monk who is not using elixirs, or a strength-based character who wants a different elixir equipped, or just doesn't want to use elixirs at all. Now, those can still be very powerful builds, but for like a non-elixir Tavern Brawler monk, the Mighty Cloth can be pretty good, though that character probably wants the Graceful Cloth instead. But that is a relatively narrow use case that requires you to be sort of house ruling yourself away from using a very powerful option. Obviously, this is a house rule that I like, because I'm sort of opposed to the strength elixirs in general, so the Mighty Cloth I do use sometimes, but from a strict optimization perspective, it's just way better to use elixirs than to equip the Mighty Cloth. For that reason, because you have to be doing sort of very specific things in order for the Mighty Cloth to be at all useful, I'm going to put it in B tier. It's still a powerful effect, stat increases are still very good, and this would be a top tier item if the elixirs didn't exist, but since they do in Baldur's Gate 3, they sort of eat this item's role. The Moon Devotion Robe. So the Moon Devotion Robe gives you +1 to your saving throws and advantage on constitution saves. So it makes you amazing at passing concentration checks. It also gives you the ability to cast Mage Armor once per long rest. It's called Lunar Bulwark, but it just gives you Mage Armor, and once per long rest is as often as you need Mage Armor. So it basically gives you Mage Armor for free without having to learn or prepare the spell or whatever. You also get Produce Flame, the cantrip Produce Flame, castable at will, and when you have Mage Armor active, which you always will, when you make a saving throw, the source of that saving throw takes 1d4 radiant damage. That can be moderately useful if you're doing some kind of like radiating orb build, but if you're doing that, you're probably using the luminous armor instead of the Moon Devotion Robe. But the fact that this gives you +1 to your saving throws and advantage on constitution saves just makes it perfect for casters who need to maintain concentration. So it's probably the best of the purely defensive options available in Act 2. It's basically competing with the Enraging Heart Garb, because they both increase your constitution saves. The Enraging Heart Garb significantly less, because it only gives you +1. This gives you +1 and advantage, as well as +1 on all of your other saving throws, which is pretty nice. But the Enraging Heart Garb gives you a bunch more hit points, which might be relevant if you're planning to take a lot of hits and need to maintain concentration. I think that this is an A tier item. It's a very good, purely defensive robe, but it is a purely defensive robe, and for the most part with robes you are looking for offense rather than defense, but if you need defense, this is probably the go-to item in Act 2. The Obsidian Laced Robe. The Obsidian Laced Robe gives you resistance to fire damage, which is both a quite relevant damage type to have resistance to. It's the most common damage type in the game. And also, there are more encounters where you're going to be taking only fire damage than there are of most other damage types. So you can swap this in when you're entering an encounter that you know is going to be mostly fire damage. It also gives you, whenever you succeed on a saving throw against an enemy's spell, they take 1d4 plus your proficiency bonus in fire damage. So plus 3 at this point probably, and plus 4 by the end of the game, so 1d4 plus 4 fire damage. Obviously that's not a significant benefit, so it's mostly for the resistance to fire damage. All of the same problems that the Robe of Summer has apply to the fire resistance, but fire resistance is both a more relevant damage resistance than cold, usually, and also there are more encounters where you know for certain that you're going to take fire damage than there are cold damage. So I'm going to put the Obsidian Lace Robe in C tier. You can swap it in if you really want resistance to fire damage for a specific encounter. The Potent Robe. The Potent Robe gives you +1 to your armor class, which is, as we're seeing, sort of relatively rare amongst robes, so that already is pretty good by itself, and gives you additional damage equal to your charisma modifier whenever you hit an enemy with a cantrip. Now, obviously this is best for warlocks because their cantrips include Eldritch Blast, which fires multiple beams, so that applies the multiples of charisma damage several times. And of course they also have Agonizing Blast, they're likely to have high charisma, so the Potent Robe effectively increases your Eldritch Blast damage significantly. But it's also good for other casters. Just any caster can benefit from additional damage on their cantrips. Just makes them more reliable for finishing off low health enemies or doing just some additional damage. And you get the Well-Liked and Well-Fortified passive, where at the beginning of your turn, you get temporary hit points equal to your charisma modifier. So this is going to be like between +4 and +7, depending on exactly what story choices you've taken and what point in the game you are, hit points every turn for a charisma-based caster, which means that the sort of incidental chip damage that you might be taking in an encounter, you can totally ignore. I'll be honest, when I read this ability, my mind was kind of blown, because any one of the, this item, my mind was kind of blown, because any one of these abilities would be awesome, and you get all of them in a single item. This is obviously the best in slot item for warlocks, but also just very good for other characters as well. The sheer amount of damage that you're going to get is ridiculous, and it gives you a pretty reasonable amount of survivability for long fights. The Potent Robe, obviously S tier, best with Eldritch Blast, but don't be afraid to equip it on other characters as well. And finally, the last robe for Act 2, the Robe of Exquisite Focus. This just gives you a +1 to your spell save DC, so this is actually only the second robe that you have access to in the game that gives you a +1 to your spell save DC, with the other being the Protecty Sparkswall. But this comes much later in the game, and you would only ever need it if you have two characters that both want +1 to save DCs in their chest slot, because the Protecty Sparkswall is just strictly better. The Lightning Charge effect is just a free bonus on top of this item's effect, so you will always use the Protecty Sparkswall over this if you have both of them, from a mechanical standpoint, because the Robe of Exquisite Focus does look pretty cool. For that reason, you need like 2 wizards or 2 sorcerers in your party, both of whom want plus save DC. By the time you get this item, you will also have just other items that increase your save DC, so it's a much less unique effect than the Sparkswall is when you get that. So this just coming late enough in the game makes the +1 to save DC much less exciting than it was earlier. Now that's still a powerful effect, and something that you're definitely still able to use, and so if you do have your double sorcerer party or whatever, then the Robe of Exquisite Focus will still see some play, so I'm going to put it in B tier, but the Protecty Sparkswall is strictly dominant over this item, so the chances of it seeing use in actual play are low unless you're doing a very specific party setup. Next up, the Act 3 armors, starting with the Bonespike Garb. The Bonespike Garb gives you 15 temporary hit points, which is a lot every time you enter a rage, and reduces all incoming damage by 2. And when you're struck by a melee attack, the enemy takes your Constitution modifier in piercing damage. The con modifier damage return is not bad, because you're probably going to be building this on a character with high con, since they intend to take a lot of hits, so that can be like 3 or 4 return damage, which adds up if you're taking a lot of hits. Obviously, this is intended as a barbarian item, and it's very good for barbarians. The 15 temporary hit points really can help you go a lot further in a lot of combats. Damage reduction combines very well with temporary hit points, because the damage reduction makes those temporary hit points inherently more valuable. And the return damage is pretty relevant on a barbarian as well. This item also plays reasonably well with monks, and very, very well with monk-barbarian multiclasses, but ironically the character that actually uses this the absolute best is the Abjuration Wizard. The damage reduction stacks with your Arcane Ward damage reduction, and the return damage stacks with your return damage from Armour of Agathis and so on. So the Bonespike Garb just increases the power level of that character significantly by stacking on top of what you're already doing. Damage reduction scales with other damage reduction non-linearly. The more of it you have, the better each point of it is. So stacking more of it on top of your Abjuration Wizard damage reduction is really, really good. Funnily enough, this item works best for a character it definitely wasn't intended to be equipped by, but it's actually best in slot for that character. It's also just very good for barbarians, totally reasonable for monks, so it's an S tier item, just a very solid armor set overall. The best by default, if you don't know what to wear in your chest slot for like a cloth or robe, put on the Bonespike Garb, and it will almost always be totally reasonable, and then very, very good for some specific characters. Next up, the Unique Cloth Armor. So this is either an Easter egg or cut content or a database entry error, and I'm not entirely sure what it's supposed to be. But as you can see from the picture, it's a broken version of the Bloodguzzler Garb and has exactly the same mechanical effect as the Bloodguzzler Garb, where it gives you wrath whenever you take damage from an enemy. When you wear it on your character, it has the identical texture. It's found in Heapside Prison, just like on a table, the cloth armor, and I don't understand. I haven't gotten the joke. If there's a joke there about the Bloodguzzler Garb, I don't exactly know what it's referring to. So if somebody does know, let me know in the comments. But the cloth armor itself being identical to the Bloodguzzler Garb, giving you wrath, that was a pretty mediocre item when we got it in Act 1, and it's significantly worse when you get it in Act 3. So from a mechanical perspective, it's a D tier item, but I'm not entirely sure what it's doing there or what the Easter egg that we're supposed to be looking for is. So, let me know in the comments. The Cloth of Authority. The Cloth of Authority gives you +1 to your armor class, advantage on intimidation and insight checks, which is pretty useful for insight in particular, because insight is a hidden roll, so you usually can't boost insight checks with like guidance or enhanceability or anything like that, unless you know in advance that you're going to have to do them. So just having passive advantage on insight checks is actually pretty useful compared to a lot of other spell checks. And you're immune to Frightened. Immunity to Frightened is a pretty useful ability, just a reasonably powerful ability, but by this point in the game, you should have other sources of fear immunity. +1 to your armor class is fine, and the advantage to insight checks is fine. All of these together all of these individually are okay abilities, but when you wrap a bunch of sort of mid abilities up into a single package, what you don't get is a powerful item. Your items you want to be specialized to do something that you can't get elsewhere, and these are all abilities that are either easily duplicated by low resource expenditure things, or just not that powerful in the first place. So the Cloth of Authority is, unfortunately, I'm going to say C tier. The main thing that you would want it for is the advantage on insight check, insight check advantage and the fear immunity. So if you aren't using Hero's Feast or don't have other sources of fear immunity available, it can be useful. But other than that, it's just not going to see much play. The Drunken Cloth. The Drunken Cloth gives you the ability to, while drunk, so whenever you drink alcohol, which you can do as a bonus action, you have advantage on Constitution saving throws, and gain temporary hit points equal to your con modifier at the start of your turn. That's probably +3 temporary hit points at the start of your turn, though if you're using like the Amulet of Health, it can be quite a bit higher, but the temporary hit points here are going to be reasonably relevant, but not incredibly relevant. Now, this is very useful if you plan to take consistent damage from something, like maybe you are an evocation wizard who's doing the thing where you stand in your own wall of fire. and are just taking consistent chip damage, so the temporary hit points offset that, and the advantage on con saves means that you won't lose concentration on your own wall of fire from the burning damage. But for the most part, this is just a purely defensive robe that requires you to get drunk ahead of time. So that eats your bonus action in combat or requires you to drink alcohol before combat starts. So it's relatively situational. Obviously, advantage on con saves is a pretty powerful effect, like the Moon Devotion Robe giving you that is quite powerful, but it's significantly weaker than the Moon Devotion Robe because it's situational and doesn't have all of the other great abilities that the Moon Devotion Robe has. The Drunken Cloth, I'm going to say, is a C-tier item. By this point in the game, you should really have your con saves and your concentration checks sorted out. Your character should be in a position where they aren't failing concentration checks that frequently, and the fact that you have to consistently drink alcohol to make it work does make this item more difficult. I will say that the idea of the drunk evocation wizard standing in their own wall of fire while constantly chugging alcohol to remain immune to the fire damage is very, very funny, and one that I definitely want to explore further. But other than that, I don't think the Drunken Cloth has particular uses for most characters. Garb of the Land and Sky. So this one is a relatively difficult item to rate because it's incredibly bugged right now. It has pretty severe bugs with the item. So I'm going to explain what it's supposed to do and what it actually does. Garb of the Land and Sky gives you Mountainous Poise, which gives you, whenever you're using Patient Defense, you also benefit from Blade Ward, which gives you resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage. Now, if you're using Patient Defense, then you're probably in a bad situation, so having incoming damage and giving enemies disadvantage on attack rolls is pretty powerful if you find yourself surrounded by a bunch of enemies. You could potentially use this with, as a sort of purely defensive character, maybe for a solo monk, this would be a pretty powerful strategy where you enter patient defense and then that just wins you all of your combat encounters because you just enemies can't hit you, and if they do hit you, they only do half damage. But patient defense itself is very costly to use for a monk, especially at this point in the game where your flurry of blows will be hitting for monster damage, so you're giving up a lot to use that ability. You also get +1 armor class, which of course is always relevant for every character, including for monks, because they often have a hard time boosting their armor class to high levels. And you get the Breeze Swift Speed ability, which is supposed to, whenever you use Step of the Wind, make your next attack deal 1d8 extra force damage and have advantage. But they messed up the coding, so the effect of it only dispels when you make a weapon attack. If you make an unarmed attack or a throwing attack, the effect doesn't go away, and so every attack you make that turn, when you use Step of the Wind, can have +1d8 force damage and advantage on all of your attacks. So that bug obviously makes the item way more powerful. Now, this isn't as game-breaking as it sounds, because advantage on all your attacks isn't that relevant for a Tavern Brawler monk, who will be hitting all of their attacks anyways, thanks to Tavern Brawler breaking bounded accuracy. And having to use Step of the Wind in order to trigger the advantage and extra damage means that's a flurry of blows that you're not using, because Step of the Wind takes a bonus action, and this effect only lasts one turn. So you do actually still give up damage to activate this effect, even when it's bugged. That being said, Step of the Wind is a powerful ability that you'll use pretty frequently in combat, just naturally, to get to enemies. And the fact that this increases all of your damage when you are doing something that you would be doing anyways is pretty darn good. Alongside the options it gives you for patient defense and the +1 armor class, this is a very powerful item. I'm going to put it in A tier because even including the bugs, and then it would probably still be an A tier without the bug, because this is mostly just a nice benefit for the occasional circumstance where you need to use Step of the Wind to get to an enemy. It will allow you to do a little bit of extra damage that turn, but the amount of damage that it does is significantly less than just doing an extra flurry of blows, so in most encounters, you're not gaining a ton of damage off of this item, and the other abilities aren't that important. Still a solid item, nice bonus, A tier. The Mutilated Carapace. The Mutilated Carapace gives you +1 to attack and damage rolls while shapeshifting or disguised. This is obviously intended primarily for the Dark Urge with their Slayer form, but works for druids who are entering Wild Shape, but also works for anyone using the Disguise Self spell. So for basically anyone, this can be a +1 to your attack and damage rolls, just on your chest slot, which is not bad in and of itself. It also gives you advantage on deception and persuasion checks, and +1 armor class. Now, you have to be disguised all the time to gain a benefit from this, but +1 on your attack and damage rolls is quite good. It's very similar to the Graceful Cloth or the Mighty Cloth, but less powerful than either of those because it doesn't actually increase your stats. Advantage on deception and persuasion. By the time in the game that you get this item, you've made most of the relevant conversation checks that you're going to be making, but this is not something that you're going to say no to, the advantage on deception or persuasion, and +1 armor class is always pretty reasonable. Again, this is very similar, I think, to the Cloth of Authority, where a bunch of sort of medium abilities all packed that don't really work together, all packed into a single item, don't really make an item that I'm that excited about. But +1 to attack and damage is a pretty powerful effect that if you don't have anything better to wear, you're going to be reasonably happy to have. This is best on characters that are making a lot of attacks per round, so you can use this to disguise yourself with a monk, and just gain +1 to your attack rolls and damage rolls with your monk. You can use this on a moon druid who makes a lot of attacks. You can use this on a dagger rogue, that kind of thing. But the best is probably, this is all attack and damage rolls, so the best choice is probably like an Eldritch Blast Warlock for this, though they do have the potent robe. And of course you have to be disguised all the time to gain the benefits from it. I'm going to say that this is a kind of medium bonus and put it in B tier. It's a totally fine item. All of the abilities are fine, and it looks incredibly awesome, obviously, so it's a little too bad that it's not a little bit better than it actually is, but the abilities don't work together super well, and none of them on their own are powerful enough to make me really excited about this item. The Robe of the Weave. The Robe of the Weave gives you +1 to your spell save DC and your spell attack rolls, and +2 to your armor class. As well, whenever you succeed on a saving throw against a spell, you heal for 1d6 hit points. The heal is not relevant at all, but +1 to spell save DC and +1 to spell attack rolls is obviously awesome. +2 armor class is great. This is just an upgraded version of the Protecty Sparkswall, which you've probably been wearing up to this point if you care about your save DCs. This is just the best robe for wizards because it just gives you 2 stats that wizards care about, or spellcasters in general. It gives you armor class available, and the highest armor class available from a clothing set. It gives you +2 of, and it increases your save DCs and your spell attack rolls. Strict upgrade over an item that you were probably wearing already, so this is just the best in slot for spellcasters in Act 3. Sorcerers and wizards, they're almost all going to end up wearing this if they don't have a specific other option in mind, and especially if they don't need initiative from like the Graceful Cloth or something like that. The Robe of the Weave is just going to be the best for every spellcaster. S tier item. The Robe of Supreme Defenses. The Robe of Supreme Defenses gives you, when concentrating, you add your spellcasting modifier to your saving throws, all of your saving throws, and also get +1 to your armor class. Increasing your saving throws by your spellcasting modifier is huge. That means you will probably never fail saves in like most reasonable circumstances. So if you're worried about making saving throws, the Robe of Supreme Defenses is very good. Obviously, one use of this is to maintain concentration on spells by increasing your con save by like +5 or +7, up to +6 or 7, with your spellcasting modifier, but also just making sure that you pass all other saving throws is pretty good if you're going into a fight where you know you're going to have to make some saving throws. The Robe of Supreme Defenses is just the best robe for defenses in Act 3. It is actually the best defensive option if you know that you're going to have to make saving throws. Now, defensive options are not that exciting in Act 3 especially. You should be at the point where you have all of your defenses in place, such as you need, and most fights are not going to come down to you making saving throws, especially on your vulnerable spellcasting characters. For that reason, I'm going to put it in B tier, because while this is a very powerful effect, it's powerful in the wrong direction. It's just not something that you really want to be spending time doing. And unlike the sort of earlier defensive options, like the Infernal Robe and the Moon Devotion Robe, the Enraging Heart Garb, you got those in earlier acts where you might not yet have your character fully kitted out with offensive and defensive options. By the time you're in Act 3, you just don't need effects like this that frequently. But if you do need this effect, this is the best version of it. The Shelter of Athkatla. So this gives you advantage on saving throws against spells. So all spells you have advantage on the saving throw against. Now, this is significantly less powerful than other items that give you saving throw bonuses. In particular, the Robe of Supreme Defenses just blows this out of the water in terms of saving throw bonuses, because that applies to concentration checks to maintain concentration. It applies to non-spell sources of saving throws, of which there are many, including like psychic powers and stuff like that, and class abilities, which don't always count as spells. And so the Robe of Supreme Defenses is just going to be way better if you want a defensive option than the Shelter of Athkatla. However, it also gives you the ability to cast Mirror Image once per day. Once per long rest, you can cast Mirror Image, and then, just like the Icebite Robe, you could equip another item. So you could, before combat, cast Mirror Image and then swap to a different item for the Shelter of Athkatla. Now, Mirror Image once per long rest is just not something I'm that excited about, and if we want Mirror Image for a specific fight, scrolls of Mirror Image are pretty easy to come by, so it's just not something that I think is that important to have available, and it's irritating to be item swapping to use these abilities, so while, if you've got a lot of patience, then certainly go for it, and you will optimize your party just a little bit by casting Mirror Image with one character, using the Shelter to avoid expending resources before going into important fights. But honestly, the effect is just not worth the hassle, in my opinion. I'm going to put it in C tier because there is a relevant use case, which is Mirror Image before fights, but even that use case isn't that powerful and also annoying to use, so I think that people are unlikely to want to use this item, and you certainly won't be missing it if you don't. Veil of the Morning. The Veil of the Morning gives you Turn Undead once per long rest, which always uses your Wisdom, no matter what spellcasting class you are. I don't know if this is a bug or intentional, but it means that for non-wisdom casters, so not druids or clerics, the Turn Undead is very rarely going to succeed, but also gives you the passive ability that undead have disadvantage on attacks against you, and you have advantage on saves against their spells and effects. This is pretty useful in fights with specific powerful undead, but is it useful enough to forego a more generically powerful effect? Usually not. Undead having disadvantage on attacks against you is better than, like, the +2 AC from the Robe of the Weave, but not, honestly, by that much. Disadvantage on attacks against you is worth, like, 3.5, sort of -3.5 to their roll on average, whereas 2 AC is worth -2 to their roll on average, so the Veil of the Morning is only slightly better for actually defending yourself from enemy attacks than just increased armor class. And the advantage on saves is useful for like fear auras, but you should be immune to those, or other effects that undead might have. The Veil of the Morning is just usually outclassed by just more generically powerful options, even in the fights that it's specifically supposed to be good in. Also, how often do you want to go into a fight with undead and say, the plan for this fight is that my wizard gets attacked so that the enemy has disadvantage on saving throws against them? I would wager not that often. This is a purely defensive, very situational item, and so I'm going to put it in D tier, because even for the fights that it's supposed to be used in, it's just not that powerful, so D tier item. The Vest of Soul Rejuvenation. So this is the other sort of Act 3 monk item that gives you +2 to your armor class, which means that alongside the Robe of the Weave, it's one of only 2 robes that give you +2 to your armor class. So already it's pretty good there, because it's just the best way to increase your armor class with cloth armor alongside the Robe of the Weave. It also heals you for 1d4 whenever you succeed on a saving throw against a spell, which is slightly worse than the Robe of the Weave's 1d6, but will maybe trigger slightly more often, because this is probably being worn by a monk, who are more likely to be the target of spells than wizards are, if you have good positioning. And it gives you greater Kushigo counter, which lets you use a reaction to make an unarmed strike against an enemy who misses you. Basically, this is +2 armor class and some very marginal additional abilities. So you sort of have to compare it to the Garb of the Land and Sky, which is +1 armor class alongside some very marginal additional abilities. Slightly better because they are bugged, but even still, it's whether you want to be more effective on turns where you use Step of the Wind to dash with the Garb of Land and Sky, or more effective on turns where an enemy attacks you and misses, and also just have higher armor class. In general, I think the Vest of Soul Rejuvenation wins out, and so I'm going to place it in S tier as the best in slot armor for monks. But I will say that compared to, like, the Robe of the Weave, which is an actively good item, or the Potent Robe, which is an actively good item that you want to use, the Vest of Soul Rejuvenation is sort of in S tier by default, because there just aren't really good monk clothings on into the late game, which is why a lot of times you'll see monks wear, like, the Helldusk armor instead of any of their armor options, because the Vest of Soul Rejuvenation is fine. I mean, it's a totally reasonable item. +2 to AC is very good for a monk, and the counter it will come up occasionally, deal decent amounts of damage, but it's not an item that you're super excited about, so it's in S tier sort of by default as best in slot for monks, but still not that strong, if that makes sense. Viconia's Priestess Robe. So this gives you +1 to your armor class, which is okay for a robe. Gives you, while obscured, you have advantage on stealth checks, so whenever you are in darkness or hiding or have turned off all the lights in the room, you have advantage on stealth checks, and your Shield of Faith gives you +2 to saving throws in addition to +2 armor class. Obviously, Shield of Faith is a garbage ability that you are certainly not going to be concentrating on at this point in the game. Like, maybe it's relevant for some characters in the very early game, just to have a day-long concentration effect, if you want to use it for Concentrated Blast, or to trigger your Robe of Supreme Defenses or something like that. But for the most part, this is a very poor use of your concentration. Adding 2 to your saves on it does not make it relevant to cast. +1 to your armor class, well, you can get that through a lot of items that actually make your character stronger, and advantage on stealth checks, well, there's an item that gives you +1 to armor class and advantage on stealth checks, but also just is wildly better than Viconia's Priestess Robe, and that, of course, is the Graceful Cloth, which just does everything that this item does, but way, way better, and does a lot of other things besides. Viconia's Priestess Robe, by the time you get it, you just don't want these effects, because you've had the Graceful Cloth for a long time, and even if you weren't comparing it directly to a very powerful item, it still just doesn't give you that much. These are, again, situational abilities that none of them are that strong on their own, and they don't work particularly well together, so altogether that just adds up to an item that's quite weak, D tier. And finally, the Wavemother's Robe. The Wavemother's Robe gives you resistance to fire and cold damage, so it combines the Robe of Summer and the Obsidian Lace Robe into a single item, which is pretty nice in and of itself. And when you are standing in water, you heal 1d4 additional hit points every turn, or you heal 1d4 hit points at the start of each of your turn, as long as you're standing in a water surface, which of course is easy to arrange in most fights in Baldur's Gate 3. You also get once per day a cast of Create or Destroy Water at 4th level, which is pretty nice, especially now that the cantrip cast of Create or Destroy Water, the bugged cantrip version of it that used to be in the game, has been patched out. And you get +1 armor class. A big Create Water is a pretty relevant ability for a lot of characters. Resistance to fire and cold damage is fine. It's not amazing, but it's totally fine. And the heal from standing in water, again, not great, but it's something that you're happy to have. And unlike a lot of these other abilities, these are all abilities that work reasonably well together. It's just a lot of defensive items, defensive options, all in the same package. And so you might swap this in for a fight where you know you're going to take fire or cold damage. You might swap this in to use a big Create or Destroy Water before combat starts in order to set up like the wet effect on a bunch of enemies, and +1 armor class just rounds it out as a totally reasonable item. Healing every turn can also be useful to trigger effects that care about healing. It triggers some of the items that give you buffs when healing, but not others. But it still is pretty useful to apply like Bless and Blade Ward to yourself every turn with the Wavemother's Robe. So you can definitely gain some benefits from this item just with the constant healing effect and all of the resistances and stuff together. Does that put it up into A tier? I don't think so. I think this is a solid B tier item where there's a lot of stuff going on and it's all totally fine. And you can definitely build strategies around this item that make the Create or Destroy Water pretty relevant, that make the healing relevant. By itself, it's not going to do better than most of the default great items, but it's a totally reasonable robe, and one that you won't mind having in your back pocket, or that you can build a strategy around. Alright, my friends, I hope that you have enjoyed this look at all of the robes in Baldur's Gate 3, all the cloth armors and robes. If you think there is something that I misplaced, if I misplaced any of these items, do not hesitate to let me know in the comments, which I know you won't, of course, but, you know, I have moved things around based on community feedback, so I'm very open to people letting me know if there's something that I have missed, or some strategy that you think is enabled by one of these items that I didn't consider, then definitely let me know, and it's possible I will adjust the placement of these items as we get on into future installments. My main takeaway from this, from looking at robes here, is that there are surprisingly few good ones. I knew there weren't that many, like, great robes. There weren't that many S-tier robes, which is expected because robes, like I said at the beginning, are exclusive, so only the very best are going to see much play in any given playthrough. But I was surprised by how even amongst the S-tier items, there's a few that are sort of only there by default, just because they're the best version of that effect that you have at that point in the game, like the Sparkswall and the Vest of Soul Rejuvenation. But the items that are really, really good are really, really good. The Graceful Cloth, the Bonespike Garb, the Robe of the Weave, and the Potent Robe are excellent items that really blow all of these others out of the water, so those are the ones that I would keep in mind for when you're trying to build your characters. As always, if you've enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave a comment and like the video. Helps me out a ton with the algorithm, so I do appreciate it. Your time, I know, is valuable, so I really appreciate people taking the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for future installments of this tier list, where we get on into the rest of the armors and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.